Start a little bit early, and hopefully we'll have extra time for questions at the end that way.
Okay, so first we wanted to introduce ourselves, and then we're going to do a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about here today, and then we'll launch right into the presentation. So my name is Cameron. I live in Chiba. I'm a second year JET now. My students like to call me Camera. They think it's the funniest thing ever. And sometimes my students like to call me Cameron Diaz. So it's a good time.
Yes, excellent. And my name's Sabrina. I'm down south in Okayama Prefecture. I'm also a second year JET. And I don't get a nickname with my students, but I do get a theme song, because apparently there's a hit song with my name out that came out right before I got here. So I get a theme song every time I enter the room. It's kind of awesome.
Fabulous.
My life is a musical.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're going to briefly go over some ground rules. We do know that queer and trans spaces need to be safe spaces. So the first rule that we hope that you will abide by is a rule of confidentiality. So there's lots of folks in here who are in different stages of coming out, lots of folks with different identities, and so we wanted to make sure that take the things that you learn from this workshop and take the things that you are really holding on to, but maybe leave the names and leave like the individual people and their stories kind of, unless you have their permission. It's good to respect people's confidentiality. Another thing too that dovetails with that is not making assumptions about the people in this room. So we don't know what everyone's identity is. We don't know how they identify with their gender, their sexuality. So no assumptions. Try to keep that in check.
Don't head out after this. Oh my God, there was this awesome lesbian that was giving the panel name Sabrina. You don't know what's going on. You don't know if I'm out or anything. So just make your connections, make your friends. But what happens in this room is pretty much staying in here. Just to respect people. Okay.
Cool. Are we cool with that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Woo! Okay. So I'm just going to go over briefly the topics that we're covering. So we're going to be talking about the history.
Q&A. Just a quick mention.
Sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead,
I forgot that. We forgot this bit. Because we have ridiculous amounts of stuff to cover, as Cameron's going to explain here, we're asking everyone to hold questions until the end of the presentation. We are not experts in what we're talking about, so if you notice, we've done some research into the areas that we don't have personal experience with, but if you notice a glaring omission or something that really, really needs to be addressed, feel free to pipe up and let us know. But any questions, please try and hold them to the end just so we can get through all of the info first, okay?
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Sabrina. So really briefly, we're going to be talking about, we're going to do a very brief overview of the history of quote-unquote queerness in Japan. We're going to be talking about the present day and what quote-unquote queerness means here in Japan. We're going to talk about coming out in your workplace. We're going to talk about bringing partners to Japan if you have partners, same-sex partners. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how to make your classrooms fabulous, gender fabulous. And we're also going to talk about how to form community. Some of us are not in big cities. Some of us are out in the countryside. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to form community.
Yeah.
So with that, one brief note. We're going to be using the word queer as an umbrella term. We recognize that there are limitations to the word, and the word queer may or may not work here in Japan, and I'll go into that in detail later. But we're using queer as an empowering term, as an umbrella term for the many different types of genders and sexualities that we have in the room and in the world. So with that, we're going to launch straight into the history of quote-unquote, I'm going to stop saying quote-unquote, I'm going to say queerness in Japan, okay?
All right, cool. So very, very brief history. We could probably write a paper on this, but we've got limited time. The only reason that we're really addressing this is because the history of queerness in Japan is a little bit different than what we might have learned about in Europe and the Americas, the history in those areas. And it's important to understand in order to really get a grasp of what the situation is like here in the present day in Japan for queer Japanese people. And that's going to spill over onto you. So basically, when we're talking historical Japan, we're just saying pre-Western influence, so pre-Meiji Restoration, and even more than that, pre-end of isolationism, I guess is the best way to put it. The big thing is that it wasn't, when we think about homosexual and queer history in the West, it's more about sex acts. And in Japan, it was much more about the companionship. There was not this concept of queer relationships per se. It was just more it was more of a bonding thing. Like, for example, we're talking here about same-sex relationships being beautiful between men. The samurai had what was called the Bushido Code, I believe, where you were actually encouraged to take up a sexual relationship with younger trainee samurai, younger male samurai. In that way, you were kind of imparting your knowledge to them and imparting some of your strengths to them so that when they moved on to their own solo travels, they would be ready. They would have that connection with their teachers. It was also sort of a way of taking their beauty and purity back into yourself and keeping you on the right track, if that makes any sense. It's a little mixed up, but we don't have a ton of time. There was not a lot of religious condemnation. In the West, we think a lot about religious condemnation coming in and kind of pushing the emphasis away from this is okay, and that didn't really happen in Japan. Most of the issues that would come up were purely practical or based around gender roles. There's a very strict historical gender binary in Japan. It's a little bit different than the gender binaries in Europe and the Americas. For example, women could carry bladed weapons as long as they were short and defend the homestead and things while the men were away. But if you were to take on a female lover and get caught, that's stepping into the men's role a little bit too far, and that was not really something you were supposed to do. So if a same-sex female couple were to get in trouble, it wouldn't be because they were doing something that was bad or wrong. It was that you were trying to be a man, and that's not okay. It's not okay, apparently. So, and a little bit about queerness in the theater. Much like in Europe, women were not allowed on stage in Japan in historical Japanese theater, but that did not necessarily mean that the men were just playing the female roles. A lot of the roles would be written without a specific gender designation. So you would have very androgynous characters, and then you would be able to get sort of a homoerotic subtext, and depending on the audience member, that might change what the story was. Are you watching two men in love? Are you watching a man and a woman in love? Are you watching a man and just an androgynous person in love? It very much varied. So, and it was very okay in that sort of sphere. The sort of homoerotic undercurrent was perfectly fine in fiction, and technically fine in reality, just as long as you were staying within your established gender roles. That's a lot of information in a very short period of time. I'm sorry I left a ton out, but we'll pass this on to Cameron with the much more important stuff about the present day.
Okay, so why does this matter? So, queerness in Japan. So this is a lot of text, and we're going to spend a lot of time on here because I think this really sets a huge framework for how you're going to understand things like coming out, things like talking to your students, and other kinds of things that are going to be happening as you're an ALT or a CIR here in Japan. So, thank you for the very brief history from Sabrina. I think something that's really important to note about Japan is that there is not a lot of public visibility of all the nuances of the LGBT community in Japan. There are many very popular celebrities, comedians who are transgender, and so a lot of Japanese people will associate and collapse all of the different nuances of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender identities into like a transgender narrative. And most of these comedians are comedians, and a lot of them are very open with their history with sex work. So you actually do have this hyper visibility of the transgender body here in Japan. But other than that, like in terms of sexuality and like the nuances of sexuality, it's not as visible here in Japan. And I think the reason why is because in Japan, this idea that you identify and form a very core part of yourself with things that turn you on is a very Western concept. And to us it seems very normal. If you come from a Western country, it seems very normal. Oh yeah, things that turn me on, I can form community, I form a huge part of my identity around it. I make my friends, I can go into certain bars and clubs and I can do all of that. But in Japan, a sexual identity is not so important. And it seems really strange. And when I get to the bottom of this slide, I'll give an example. And so because like Sabrina was talking about, there isn't a lot of religious condemnation of same-sex relationships. That condemnation really comes externally from the West, I would say. So if and when queerness does come up in conversation with a Japanese person, a lot of times there's this dismissiveness, so there's this idea that it doesn't exist in Japan. Right? It just doesn't happen in Japan. That's like out there. It's not here in Japan, right? So you get that, and that of course leads to a whole bunch of different types of erasure and invisibility of a lot of people here in Japan. On the flip side, though, I think what is important in Japan that may or may not be the same in the West is gender roles, and binary gender roles to be specific. So what we mean by that is the men are going out and getting the money, and the women are staying at home generally and doing the housework and taking care of the children. Of course there are exceptions, and with international feminism things are changing, but as of right now that's generally the framework. And so since gender roles are more important than a sexual identity, you see a lot of different ways in which Japanese bodies are organized in society. And so as a result, so I'm on the fourth bullet point. Sorry, this is really hard to follow. Homosexual overtones are often ignored because we don't see this sexual identity as something that's very primary, something that's very essential. So, for example, when I'm in the hallway with my students during break, I often see two of my male students sitting on each other's lap, or even cuddling on the bench. And this is normal.
Really
This is it's very cute. But to us, we see oh wow, sexual identity is really important, so they must be gay, right? But in Japan, that's not seen as a sexual thing, and that's not seen as part of their identities. That's just them being intimate and being friends.
Mm-hmm.
So does that make a little bit more sense of how gender identity and sexual identities are different? Okay, cool. Sorry, this is a lot. Okay, so as Sabrina was talking about, there are mostly practical, not moral objections to same-sex relationships. So oftentimes you will get questions not of, oh, you're gonna burn in hell, or oh, you're a sinner, or that's disgusting, that's wrong, that's icky, that's gross, how do you do it? You don't get those questions. Rather, you will get questions of, how will you have a family? How will you have children? These are the types of questions that you'll get. And they'll be very curious, but I don't think they're malicious questions, but they're just curious because in Japan, that's what you do. And especially since now in Japan that the population is shrinking, having children, having families, getting married is incredibly important. And I can give you some examples after the presentation if you're interested in that kind of thing. And so I've already talked about heavy emphasis on binary gender roles, identity versus act, so we're good on that. Double lives, I don't like this terminology, but this idea of double lives is actually very common. So I have a lot of male-bodied Japanese friends who have sex with other men, but they're married to women, and they have children. And to Westerners, this may seem really strange, and you may think, oh, he's closeted, oh, he's repressed, oh, he's being selfish, he's not being good to this woman, and he should just break up and come out to his family, and But like I was saying earlier, gender identity and gender roles and then your sexual identity are matched differently here in Japan. So it actually makes sense to a lot of Japanese people. Oh yeah, you have your outer face, so you have your family, but what you do on the side, what you do in your private life is no one else's business, right? So, and this is also common with straight couples as well.
Yes.
So there will also be affairs and there'll be sexual relationships on the side as well. So this is very common in Japan from my experience.
Mm-hmm. It's not as much about the idea of hiding who you are as still conforming to those gender roles, because what's going on your own in your sex life is not as important as what you're presenting to the public face. If that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah. So the last bullet point, less open discrimination equals less activism. So this kind of ties back into practical, not moral objections. So you won't see hate crimes in Japan for being queer. It's very rare. I haven't seen it as much as in the United States where I come from, for example. And I don't think it means less activism. I kind of want to change that a little bit because I think there's a lot of activism that's going on in Japan. It's just there's not as much media visibility on that activism, right? So there's stuff going on, but currently a lot of maybe your teachers or your students, when you talk to them, if you do decide to come out, which we'll get to later, this is kind of the framework in which they're working from. So it's good to be conscious of these different dynamics. And it's good to really check your cultural biases, right? Because we all come from, well, I don't know if we all, but a lot of us come from Western countries, so we have our own cultural biases. So it's good to keep those in check when we're here in Japan. So sorry, that was a lot. Are you okay? Is everyone okay? Okay, awesome, thank you.
Oops. All right. Yeah, lots of info, not much time. Coming out at work, which I'm sure a lot of people are concerned about. So Cameron was talking about the idea of your public face versus your private life. That is a huge part of Japanese culture, the concept of honne versus tatemae, your public face versus your private face. I think I got those two swapped, but basically you've got the one face that everyone sees, and that's your Genki face, that is your professional face, that is what everybody sees you are this lovely, charming person and nothing ever goes wrong in your life. And then you've got what's really going on. And the idea is which of these, how are you going to integrate your sexual or gender identity into these faces is basically the thing that you're going to have to take into account when coming out at work. There's a Japanese saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. You don't want to stand out, you want to blend in. That's a very Japanese thing to do. And unfortunately, because sex lives in particular are seen, you do not bring that up in public. You don't smooch in public. You don't give each other goodbye kisses where people can see. Are you kidding? That's, if you come out, you may risk being the nail that sticks out, and you might get squished down. But then again, we are coming from a different cultural background. So depending on how important your identity is to you, I lost my sentence. How important your identity is to you will determine whether or not you think you need to come out in the workplace. And I should clarify, at this point, I am purely talking about sexual orientation. We will talk a little bit about non-cis and trans issues in just a second. Basically, it's the idea of how much of your personal sexual identity is going to affect your work. If you want to try and do a bit more internationalization, then yeah, you may think it's better for you to come out. If you've got a partner, if it's such a core part of your identity that you think it needs to be part of your public face, then yeah, feel free to come out. If you are thinking about it and going, no, I really don't think, my coworkers are going to be too uncomfortable and they're just going to be speculating on my sex life and that's not appropriate, then keep it in, and you're not going to get judged either way in Japan. Well, there may be a bit of that, why are you telling us this thing? But if it's an important part of your identity, you are a foreigner, you are going to get a little bit more leeway with this. The exception is if you do not identify as cisgendered. I do not have personal experience with this, so if I make mistakes, someone please call me on this. But what I have heard is that because of the strict gender binary in Japan, if your gender presentation can fit into that binary, then start out with that right away. Everyone else might get a little bit of a chance to feel out the situation before they come out at work, but if, for example, you were born in a male body but you identify as female, it might be better to come out earlier on, like as soon as you can, because your coworkers will be a lot less shocked by that than by you working there for several months and then going, actually, this is not who I really am. There may be a lot more kind of conflict that comes up if you come out later. Okay. And unfortunately, if you do not fit into that strict gender binary, if you're genderqueer or if you present in a less traditional feminine or traditional masculine way, there are going to be some difficulties that come up, but the sooner you come out as that, the more likely you are to get support within your workplace.
Alright, yeah, so here's kind of a good kind of breakdown of like things that we should be thinking about when it comes to coming out at work. And to save time, Sabrina and I aren't giving our personal experiences with coming out at work, but if you are interested in the Q&A section, we can give you some information about our coming out process here in Japan. I'm going to start on the left-hand column. So on the one hand, being out at work in your home country versus Japan. So if you're out at home, wherever you come from, it may be a huge shock to quote-unquote go into the closet again, right? So that's something to think about. Again, like Sabrina was talking about, topics considered to be intimate information. What is your public face versus your private face? You have to decide that for yourself, right? Some things we may think is okay may be too much information for a Japanese person. So it's good to be aware that those public and private faces exist. Objections from coworkers and parents. Like I was saying before, they're all moral objections, or they're not moral objections or practical, so you may get a lot of personal questions. And as foreigners, we all get personal questions anyways, so just putting that out there. Yeah, so you might have some objections, but they won't be moral objections. They're not going to be like, you're sick, you're disgusting, you're filthy. Like, I've never ever heard... At least
not on the whole.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in a really rare case, but from the majority of the experiences that I've listened to and I've experienced, it's not the case. So stereotypes making it difficult to identify yourself. we're foreigners, so we have a whole bunch of stereotypes that we have to battle already before we even step off the plane. But also, being out, you're going to have those other stereotypes as well. So like I was talking about at the beginning, there's a lot of transgender celebrities, and since there isn't a lot of nuanced understandings, like a lot of times that's the framework in which Japanese people are working with, so then those stereotypes get mapped onto us, so we have to navigate those. Okay. On the other hand, positives are coming out. Grassroots internationalization, personal identity. How important is your queerness or your gender identity to you? If it's really important, part of your personal identity, maybe that's a huge benefit for you. It's a huge sigh of relief to be out in Japan. Representing the queer community and battling challenging stereotypes. It could be a really good, empowering thing to be role models for your students. It could also be a really good moment of education for a lot of Japanese people, especially if you're in the countryside where there's not a lot of exposure to queer and trans people and issues. My biggest piece of advice for coming out at work is unless you fit into, unless like maybe you're not cisgendered or you're transgender, feel out your workplace. Like be patient and feel it out and see and identify people who are allies and see if you feel comfortable first. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be happening all at once when you go to your cities. So it's important to, I would say, wait it out and see, unless it's like this very, very, very urgent thing to come out, like examples that Sabrina had talked about. But being patient and identifying allies is really important. And I'm going to put this out there, like, we as queer and trans folk know that coming out never finishes. Like, we're always coming out. It's not like we have this one moment where we just arrive, we're here, we're out, forever.
Shower of glitter.
It doesn't happen. Like, we're always coming out to people, like I might have come out just now, right, to all of you, right? So we're always coming out, right? So that process is never finished. But my hope is that with this section, you can get a better sense of how to make those own choices for yourself in your workplace.
Oh, sorry. Question. All right. So before we get into this, how many of you have a partner or spouse that you have either brought over to Japan or are thinking about bringing over to Japan? Show of hands. Okay. That's a few of you, so we'll address this, but we're going to keep this section a little shorter. I do have a lot of personal experience in this area, so I can answer some specific questions afterwards, either after the presentation or you can come and find me at the Hospitality Center at the info desk, 8 to 10 in the morning and the evening, pretty much every day. So the short version of this. At this point in time, the majority of countries on JET do not legally recognize same-sex marriage for visa purposes, which means that you cannot get a dependent or spousal visa here, which kind of sucks and makes things a little bit more complicated. But we do have other options. The basic options are you can both work on JET if you've got a partner or a spouse who is able to get onto JET. Go for it. That would probably be your best bet to make sure you both have the money situation taken care of. It is the most likely of these situations where you could get placed near each other. None of these are guaranteed, but it would be the most likely one. And you'll know your time frame. You'll both be kind of in the same boat. However, since JET is competitive, you'll have to look into some other options as well. If you've got the money for it, student visas can be a good option, but only if you've got someone willing to go back to school and the money. Working holiday visas are not eligible for U.S. nationals, but I think Australian, UK, and Canadian nationals can look into holiday working visas if money is going to be an issue, because then you're legally able to work here. But that all varies from country to country, so look into it as a potential option. For work visas, I'm actually going to skip down to the other job options bit of it there. There are a lot of ways you can get work visas other than JET. There are eikaiwas and ALT companies that hire from outside.
Oh, by the way, for those of you who don't know, eikaiwas are conversation classes.
Conversation classes. Yeah, they hire from out with Japan, so your partners can interview outside of Japan and get jobs around here. Interac, GABA, Altea, Berlitz. There are quite a few. There's also a lot of websites that have information on jobs from private companies that are hiring. The big catch is there are a decent amount of companies that are only hiring from within Japan, and it is illegal to look for work in Japan on a tourist visa. So try to avoid that so your partner doesn't get kicked out of the country. Okay? You can bring them over on a repeat tourist visa and just have them stay with you, but then you've got money issues and also the fact that the more frequently they come back, the more suspicious the government's going to be that you're trying to circumvent the visa system. So in an ideal world, world, what I would say is worst case scenario, if you're bringing a partner over, have them come over on a tourist visa and just help them network with your community. You may be able to find out that a school that a non-JET ALT is working at might be hiring, and they're fine with interviewing out with the country, but they might not be advertising it anywhere where your partner may be able to find out information about that. Use your local community, and just think about the two, when you're looking at your options, just think about housing and income issues when deciding what visa option is the best route for you. And also be prepared, there may be a lack of acceptance and understanding. It becomes more obvious when you've got a partner. That's if you start dating someone in Japan as well, that you might not encounter if you just come out of the workplace. If you were to just come out and you're single, then you might be okay. But if you've got a partner, it can complicate things just a little bit more, because then they have no choice but to recognize it and admit things that are going on. So keep that in mind if that's an important thing for you.
Okay, so moving on to my favorite part, how to make your classrooms fabulous. So there's some very easy things that we can do, and I think they're just good for life. Just in life, you should maybe adopt these or resist these types of things. So in your classrooms, you're probably going to be doing a lot of group activities, team games, group work, pair work. Something very easy to do is just avoiding using gender as a way to organize the classroom. Most of the time, you don't even have the same amount of boys and girls anyways, and my teachers are always just like, oh, boys read first, but, Riko-san, Ayumi-san, Sayaka-san, you read first. So, it's just inefficient, I think. So there's other ways in which we can split people up into groups. Like, a lot of the students have lunch groups, and there's a whole bunch of different ways. You can be creative with this, but using gender assumes that the uniform that the student is wearing is going to match up with their gender identity, which may or may not be the case. Right? We don't know what's going on with these students, especially if you're teaching junior high school and senior high school classes. So it's just something that's very easy to do, and it's actually more efficient. So another thing is avoiding gendered English, so saying, hey guys, what's up? Or assuming that the student that you're talking to is going to be interested in the opposite gender. And this is actually a lot more difficult than it sounds, because a lot of times you'll get asked the question, oh, hey, Cameron sensei, girlfriend? And a lot of times I like to put the question back on the student, so I would say, oh, do you have a girlfriend? Right, but that's a bad move, because I'm assuming that they're straight, right? So now what I say is, oh, who do you love? And all the students go very crazy. It's very fun. It's hilarious to get the reactions out of them, but it's a way to avoid assuming that they're heterosexual. Right? Japanese as a whole doesn't really have a lot of gendering, like Spanish or French, for example. And I'm not very fluent in Japanese at all, so I don't maybe have as much authority on this topic. But
Current Japanese slang has a lot less of the gendered stuff than more old-fashioned Japanese does.
Okay, thank you. But avoid adding like gendered, I don't know, how would you say, tags, suffixes to their names. So instead of using kun and chan, I usually just use san, or I'll usually just call them by their family name instead. This is something that's very easy that you can do. So you're not assuming their gender identity by their presentation. Right? Things to do, awesome. Use gender-neutral names and pronouns and activities. So I often use Cameron on my worksheets because it could be a boy's and a girl's name. I also use Pat and Sam. Alex.
Jamie,
Chris. It's very easy to do. Also use androgynous pictures. I have a culture corner in my school, and in July, for example, we have a garlic festival in California, and the idol is called Hubie, and he is this old, hairy man in a dress, a wedding dress, and he has like a wreath of garlic on his head, and so a lot of my students and teachers are asking, Cameron-san, who is he? What, why? I'm like, he's the garlic idol. He's wearing garlic on his head. You know, like normalizing, like, why is there a problem? Is there a problem here? No, there's not. He's wearing garlic on his head. So, ta-da! Internationalization, I guess.
Two birds with one stone.
Yeah. Also, like, when you first get to your schools, I don't know if your schools already do this, but mine didn't, and something that I did was I just asked the teachers to make name tags for the students, and let me rephrase that. I asked the teachers to ask the students to make name tags, and I told the students to write their preferred names or their nicknames. Students will understand the word nickname in katakana, so if you ask them for their nicknames, they can write whatever. And so I had one girl, she was like, call me Cherry, so I called her Cherry for the whole year, and that was fine. You know, like, except for the speaking tests and like the tests we had to give, Cherry was what her name was, or their name was, sorry. So just it's a good way to learn your students' names, right? So just asking the students to make the name tags for themselves and writing their name that they prefer. Being a role model, we're a little short on time, so I have some awesome stories in the classroom about like, you know, me being a positive role model and like seeing bullying and then like somehow turning my whole classroom into like Cameron chanting and like wanting to hold my hand and stuff. So I can tell you those later if you want. But we are running out of time. So in the challenging normative teasing, you'll see a lot of bullying and teasing like any country and any school. So there's ways in which we can be smart and positive, and we can normalize things. For example, Hubie the garlic idol. You can normalize those kinds of things. If you do have the opportunity to, think about lessons on queer history and people. There's awesome lesson plans on the internet, on Stonewall's website, which we'll talk about later. But I actually had the opportunity to do a lesson, and it was a really awesome experience. So if you do have the opportunity to, it's something to think about. Also, the libraries always love getting English books, no matter what they are. I like donated Naruto like manga in English, and like my librarian, like, or not my librarian, like the students and like the teacher in charge of the library like freaked out. So if you know of any like easy like English books that are like that talk about queer topics in English, you can donate those to your library. But it really depends on your relationships with your teachers. So if you build those relationships up, you can get those ideas into the classroom and into your school.
Always ask your JTs before doing these lessons, because otherwise you might get vetoed and it could mess with your relationships with your coworkers, and that's sad.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to finding community in the desert, maybe.
I don't know, maybe this is Totori? I'm not sure. Yeah. Excellent. So, a lot of us will likely be placed out in the Inaka, in the countryside, which means that the community in Japan for queer people is very spread out as it is, and it becomes even more spread out the further from the major urban centers you get. That does not mean you cannot still find community. There are ways to do it. For starters, in the rural areas, maybe because they're rural and there's a little bit less pressure, I'm not sure, but it seems like the young queer community is becoming more visible over time. It's a little bit easier to find younger queer people in the countryside than you might if you're moving closer into the city. In the city, you might get a slightly older community that is more active and more vocal about it, but in the rural areas, you can actually find a decent community of, you know, recent graduates and whatnot, so it's worth looking for. And we'll talk a little bit about this with the Stonewall slide. There are going to be clubs and like the gay districts, the queer districts in your areas, but don't assume that that's the only place you can find people. You can find people in all sorts of little hidden areas. For example, cosplay groups. If you went to a cosplay thing, even if you are not as big into kind of the otaku culture and the fanboy, fangirl culture here, going to those areas, you might find someone who, for example, identifies as trans, and that's the only sort of event they feel comfortable dressing as their preferred gender. And you can just kind of seek out other sort of minority interest communities that might not necessarily be gender or sexuality related, and you will probably run into people that you might not have otherwise found. You can also, if you've got the opportunity, you can travel to the big cities. It's not, we're going to talk a little bit about the two major scenes, but there are scenes in pretty much all the big cities. You just have to know where to find them, so take the opportunity if you really feel the need to connect like that. And then there's also social media. We have our little smartphones here. A lot of you guys probably know about Grindr and Spindle and Twitter and whatnot. But these are good places to meet up with people, and not just for relationships. Cameron can talk about that in a little bit more detail, so I'll pass that to him.
Yeah, like my first week in my town, I still had my American smartphone, and I was able to find Wi-Fi at this really small cafe. And I would go there and go on Grindr and Jacked, and I was like, I want to meet anyone. And I actually met this really nice boy named Yuta, and we got lunch at a family diner, and he introduced me to like all of his friends. And like we didn't have like a sexual relationship, but we actually became friends, and I've actually met a lot of folks in my area because of, you know, sometimes it can be sketchy, these applications, but like it was a really good experience that I had. So don't write it off. Use it. Use everything that you have at your disposal. And it's also good because in the big cities, most of the big scenes are really like revolve around alcohol. And I know not everyone drinks alcohol. And so there are other options. You don't have to go to a bar, and that can be really intimidating to go to a bar by yourself. Mm-hmm. So,
really quick, be aware, a lot of these applications on the Japanese smartphones will require some ability in Japanese, but you don't. It is not necessary. Cameron, you didn't speak any Japanese when you got here.
I didn't speak a word of Japanese. I was learning hiragana on the plane, and I was fine. Yuta, the boy that I met, he was really interested in learning English, and he travels around the world all the time. So we were actually able to have a relationship in English, but he's actually taught me a lot of Japanese. So
there you go. Social media can also improve your Japanese in the queer community.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, so there are two major scenes here in Japan. It's Shinjuku Nichome in Tokyo and Doryamacho in Osaka. I've never been to Doryamacho, but I live in Chiba, so I'm very close to Tokyo, so I've been to Nichome quite a few times, and it's a really fun place. And if you're interested, we'll talk about this at the end, but we are doing tours of Nichome here in Shinjuku tonight and tomorrow night, so if you're interested, we'll have more information at the end. But it's important to note, again, there are other communities that exist here in Japan, and you don't have to go to the bars and the clubs to go and find them.
Yeah, two of the biggest communities are actually, or most active communities are actually in Sapporo and Okinawa, so there you go. Cool. And on that note, is it okay if I go next one?
Oh yeah. So yeah, there's lots of like film festivals as well, like queer film festivals. There's lots of pride events all over Japan. There's like camping trips that are going on. But sometimes it can be really hard to find these events, especially if you don't speak Japanese. And so one way in which me personally I got really involved in like finding these events is through AJET, and the organization that is run through AJET, which is Stonewall Japan. And so Sabrina can talk about this.
Yes, so Cameron and I are both representatives for our areas in Stonewall Japan. We are block representatives. Basically, Stonewall Japan is a group about bringing together the queer and allied community within Japan, not just among the Jets, but with other ALTs, Japanese nationals, people who are expats who are over here who might not be teachers at all. It's just about bringing everyone together and creating a support group and a sense of community to just, help everyone be nice and happy. And we do a bit with raising awareness and volunteering as well. We're involved with the Pride events, we're involved with the film festivals, particularly the ones down south for some reason, but I think we're trying to get more involvement in the Tokyo one. And we're also really involved with creating more regional events. Stonewall Japan is a national organization, but the regional blocks, which you can see on, have we passed out the handout yet, actually?
Not yet.
We forgot the handout. We'll pass out the handout in a second. There will be a list of the prefectures and what block they fall into, and we try to create a lot of a database of places you can go, ways you can connect with your community, and events that are going on. For example, Cameron does a park meet.
Oh yeah, I have a picnic because queers love picnics. So I have a picnic in Yoyogi Park every month. So if you're in Tokyo area, you can come out.
Kyushu, Kagoshima, I think, has a big beach event that Stonewall tries to get involved in and bring people down to that. So there will be events in your area if you join up with Stonewall, or at least follow the website, and you can find out information. Or you can join the Facebook group, which is completely confidential. No one can, unless you are a member, you cannot see any names or anything. So if you are not out, do not worry. It's a safe space. You will be okay, and you can find out about events and ways you can meet up with people. And that is that, I think.
Yeah, so if you're interested in more information, this website is on the handout that you will receive. And Stonewall's been really great for Sabrina. Sorry, I don't mean to talk for Sabrina. It's been really great for me.
It's been good for me too.
Okay, it's been a really good experience. So it's been a good way to connect with folks and find out events in your area. And if there aren't any events in your area, I know, like for example, the park, the picnic in the park, is like something that I wanted to do, so I started that up through Stonewall, and I've been able to keep that going. So
one other benefit to Stonewall that I totally forgot, and this is what will be listed on the website as well. We also have a list of medical resources for things like testing, safe doctor's offices if you have medication needs, things like that. So it's not just about meeting up and hanging out. We do have some very important information on there.
In English too.
Yes. So please check it out. Even if you do not join up with Stonewall, please check out the website if you need any list of resources.
Yeah. And with that, we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Sorry.
I know that was a lot of information, but are there any other questions that are pressing, or just in general?
Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm here. I'll walk around with the microphone. Alright, so did you call him first? Okay. I'll go so the mic doesn't stretch that far.
Sorry. Hi, I'm straight, however, both of my parents are gay and my brother's gay, so when I'm doing introductions for my school and I introduce my family, I was wondering what's the best way to go about that.
That would be a really, really good chance for that whole grassroots internationalization thing. If your family members are queer, if you're an ally and if you're a straight ally and you have queer family members, my guess would be you'll get a lot of those questions about, well, then how did they raise you? But didn't you need both parents? And I'm sure you're used to answering those questions as it is. But the judgment should not overlap on you because they're not going to assume that, oh, you are the spawn of evil things. You are contaminated, you are, no. It will most likely just be them asking a lot of questions. I would think maybe feel out the situation before you decide if you how much you want to include in your Jiko Shokai, but I think you'd be mostly okay.
I think it's important to know that you're not obligated to do this grassroots internationalization for your queerness. You don't have to do it. Like I never talked about my family because my background is really complicated. I'm half Japanese, half Chinese. So especially with this stuff with all the islands and that got really complicated. So you don't have to necessarily talk about your family. It is important. It is interesting for people, but also don't feel that pressure that you need to do that. You can do whatever you want with your Jiko Shokai. I told jokes at my Jiko Shokai. I gave myself nicknames and stuff. And I, so, yeah.
It may be something that you might want to run by your JTEs, though, just to make sure that they're okay with it. I can't imagine that something like that they would say no, but it's going to vary from school to school, so that might be the only bit of advice. Just run it by them first.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes, or maybe 1 or 2 more questions. And then we'll also be available all throughout orientation, so if you have a personal question that you don't feel comfortable asking in the group, feel free to come up to us to talk to us.
Hi, so I'm not sure if this is too harsh of a question, but I was trying to research this, and on the JET forum, a guy claimed that someone in his prefecture was fired after coming out. How often does that happen?
I don't have the statistics or the resources to answer that question.
Stories,
but
I heard of this happening, or
I personally, yeah, and I do know that currently in Tokyo they are working to have worker discrimination laws passed to protect folks. And maybe someone from Claire could better answer this question.
Yeah.
So I will project. Okay. So one of the things that is going to come up in your don't distance yourself from me. No, I'm going to give you the spotlight. I'm trying to give you here you go. So this is something that's going to come up when people are dismissed or terminated in Japan. There is not always necessarily a clear reason given, and I think that might be one of the situations that you have heard of. And unfortunately, what this comes back to is that in Japan, as foreigners, actually not as people, as members of a certain community of a racial or sexual or gender identification, as foreign residents, there is no overarching legal framework of protection against discrimination, whether that be labor law, health, or welfare. And that's where that's going to come down to for everybody in this room, is that as a non-Japanese resident, if you are terminated, and you want to argue that, you can go to the Japanese court systems, but you can't necessarily argue it's because of discrimination, or that would be very, very difficult to prove. I have heard, I have several friends of mine have refrained from coming out in their places of work because they do not feel comfortable, they do not feel that the reaction from the community would be supportive, even though they have really, really healthy relationships with the people around them. That does happen. But at the same time, when it gets down to the legal stuff, you might not always get a clear-cut answer on that, so you do need to be careful when judging the situation. And again, like I said, identify allies, identify people that you can confide in, that you can trust in, and that might be willing to talk with you in a safe atmosphere. That's going to be your best bet, is your personal relationships and your networks here, okay?
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the statistics of jets that actually do get terminated are pretty low,
Quite
yeah?
low,
Yeah.
quite low.
So the likelihood of you getting terminated for being queer is probably about as high as the likelihood of you getting terminated for any other reason, I would think. So, yeah. It's a sad question.
Sorry.
Is it permanent as opposed to like not getting your contract renewed, or are they sort of the same situation?
I'm not sure.
So
Sorry, people.
not having your contract renewed typically only, so the standard bureaucratic line in Japan, please don't put me on the safe space, right?
That's
We're
correct.
using the safe space.
Is that, unless you have caused a massive problem for something, for some particular reason, generally your contract is probably going to be renewed. Now, coming out to your community, if, for example, that were to raise a problem with the parents, if the parents were to then turn around and say, oh, what's going on, how is this going to affect our children, and your BOE doesn't stand up for you, that might cause a situation in which you need to talk to them. But again, in that situation, that's at the end of your first year or your second year, what's going to protect you in that situation is your relationships with your teachers and your coaches and your BOEs. If they know you work hard and you've got a good, healthy relationship with them, they will likely stand up for you. Okay, and the choice does not come down to what the parents say. Ultimately, it comes down to what your superintendent says. Is to make sure you don't feel like you have to lie. Don't feel like you have to lie about who or what you are, but be judicious with the information that you share and who you share it with.
I'll give a quick personal example here. I was terrified about that exact thing happening, my contract not getting renewed. So I waited until I had no choice, until my girlfriend was going to be moving over here with me to come out to anyone at my workplace. It ended up not being any sort of an issue at all, and they keep telling me that they're already planning on looking into ways to, assuming that I continue on as I have this year, they're looking into ways to continue keeping me on even when their budget doesn't cover me anymore. So if you've got a good relationship, termination by means of lack of contract renewal is probably not going to be an issue. Hopefully. If that's at all reassuring.
Okay, and so it looks like we're out of time, and I do have to plug this from Claire. Please make sure to fill out the survey. And thank you very much for being so patient. That was a lot of information.